Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For our last standalone presentation, Don's going to get started pretty much on time because we got to, of all days, to keep a schedule. Today's the day. As wonderful as France is, we don't want to leave you behind. Those that didn't hear David's announcement or those that need a reminder, the cultural group will depart first at 9:40 a.m., followed by the Mortain excursion at 9:50 a.m. Then Falaise leaves at 10 a.m., and Pegasus Bridge and the other British sites leaves at 10:10. So Culture, 9:40, Mortain, 9:50, Falaise, 10, Pegasus, 10:10. And Stephen is giving me the Caen shuttle. We'll make announcements before the Caen shuttle departure. First departure at 9, next is 10, next is 11, next is 12, then a lunch break, 2, 3 p.m. Last shuttle returning from Caen is 3:30 p.m. So that's important because we don't want to leave you behind in Caen. So, great. So thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody in good shape today? Had a great day yesterday, a great evening, and we got a great day ahead. So we're all looking forward to it, and Don Miller is going to get us off to a great start here today. And you all be going, as you just heard, to various points in the region. But most of these programs today that you're on various buses will take you to parts of Normandy that have to do with the breakout from the beachhead. The Allies, as you will learn, had a particularly difficult time to the west on the Cotentin Peninsula and pushing, trying to break out in Saint-Lô and Mortain, and then finally to Falaise. The key problem, and you've already heard about this on your buses, you've heard the oral history parts of that, you had some of our veterans here talking in person, was the topographical feature that was such a surprise to the Allies. The challenge of getting through the Bocage or the Norman hedgerows that line the fields and roadways between the throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. So, but before we go see them and hear about the battles that took place there, we have a presentation from Don Miller who's going to tell us about Operation Cobra, and he's locked and loaded, ready to go.
Okay. Well, now that Nick has given my lecture, I don't have to say much. A little bit more than that. Breakout told us about the greatest generation the other night, and I was thinking about a video that we saw on one of our buses, I was on, about Bill Guarnier, who was a 101st Airborne hero. He took out those guns and helped to take out those guns at Breakout Manor. And he's a longtime friend of mine. And a couple years ago, my wife and I started to think about connecting Bill with the greatest generation. And my wife and I were in a hotel somewhere, and she came up to the room and said, Bill Guarnier is in the lobby, and he wants to see you. And he's with what looks to be his granddaughter or his great-granddaughter. So I went down and met him, and he goes, his beautiful blonde is sitting on his lap, and I said, how you doing? And he said, I want you to meet my new girlfriend, Stephanie. So that's why they were the greatest generation. As he said to me later, you're only as young as a woman you feel. So anyway, we got a big day here, and I'm going to try to prepare you for it. The guides are going to do the Mortain and Falaise Gap. I'll mention them, but I'm going to do the setup for it. Well, we all know this. Operation Overlord was a three-part process, and you had the break-in, okay? 36,000 assault troops hit the beaches in the first 5 waves. And then you have the buildup, okay, on the beaches, absolutely necessary. And then finally, you have the breakout into the Bocage country. And this is the crucial thing. I mean, if the Germans stop us here, they prevail. The invasion has failed completely. And so we're going to go back to this little map here in a second. And the army that the Germans had here on D-Day may not have been fully prepared for the invasion, but within weeks following D-Day, they reinforced the Calvados area immensely, and most ominously with panzer divisions, most of them concentrated near where we are at Caen. And these panzer outfits had a really hard time getting to the beachfront. They were slowed down by sabotage operations conducted by the French resistance, the Maquis. And most of all, they had murderously effective Allied air assaults launched against them. And Panzer Lehr, for example, didn't reach the area near Caen until June 9. And a panzer division called Das Reich took 17 days to go a mere 450 miles. Another outfit, wildly fanatical young Nazis called Hitler Youth, 12th SS Panzer Division. They moved at speeds no faster than 5 miles an hour. Most of the time they can move only at night because of the tremendous air cap that the Allies had. We had, as I was saying before, not just air superiority, but air supremacy. And our planes knock out 300 German trains that are headed to these beaches, and those trains are carrying infantrymen, and they're carrying artillery, and they're carrying tanks. And resistance fighters are also sabotaging dozens of other trains. Now in reprisal, and this is where this battle really gets ugly, in reprisal, infuriated at the Maquis, the panzer divisions carried out really unspeakable acts of reprisal, hanging citizens, French citizens, including children, from lampposts, shooting them randomly, burning them to death. One French town, Audore-sur-Glane, the men of Das Reich herded the women and children, just the women and children, into a wooden church, and they set it afire. And they burned 640 townspeople. The Hitler Youth Division, made up again, as I said, of fanatical young Nazis who had served on the Russian front, they were equally barbaric. In one instance, they killed in cold blood 146 Canadian prisoners. Killing prisoners, they told the Canadians before they put them away, was reprisal for the British and Canadian and American raids on their hometowns in Germany, on the Heimat, as they called it. And in the coming battle, these Canadians are going to respond with vindictive fury. Here's one of them. He said, "The Germans thought we were fucking Russians. They did stupid things, and we killed those bastards in large numbers." This gives you a sense of the volatility, the incendiary nature of this battle. This is one of those brutally fought battles on the Western Front or on the Eastern Front, compared to the Eastern Front. Because the Germans are told by Hitler to defend every foot of ground, no retreat, hold every inch. And they fought furiously, not so much for the Fuhrer, but for self-preservation. Another thing, some of these guys were doused with propaganda. The Nazis had propaganda officers called leadership officers. They were very similar to the Russian commissars on the Eastern Front, political officers who were to indoctrinate the Red Army. And what these leadership officers told the troops is that the Allies planned to not just defeat Germany, but to wipe out the entire German race and to annihilate the fatherland. They also told them if they were captured, they'd be sent to British cities that were going to be bombed into cinder and ash by Nazi rockets in the next couple of months. And this was believed. So in early July, we're off the beach, and London is being hit with German V-1 flying bombs, which killed that summer about 6,000 British citizens. The Allied armies, by this time, were 3 weeks after D-Day, had not made much ground. And they are bottled up, and right about here, in a long line, all the way across, straight across from Caen. They'd advance only 30 miles, okay? And from the landing beaches, and along a line of about 80 miles. Montgomery's really boxed in here. The Germans put most of their panzer units here because if the British break out here, they're close to flat country, which leads 40 miles south down to Falaise, and then in perhaps to the Ruhr. So this is the area closer to Germany, the area they most worried about. And Monty is facing far stauncher resistance in terms of panzer divisions than Bradley is over in this sector here. And Bradley's driving down toward Saint-Lô, okay? And so what these allies, they're fighting two different kinds of wars then. Montgomery's war is to take a city. It's urban fighting. This fighting out here, and you've heard 1,000 explanations of the Bocage. The thing to me is that the Allies were surprised about the Bocage. We've heard stories that, well, they trained in the hedgerows in England, but maybe they thought that the hedgerows in Normandy were not as imposing. And as you know, in Normandy, General Ron explained this beautifully on the beach, you know, they have heavy hardened earth and rocks up to 4 feet high and then trees up to 25 feet high. And they surround these pastures. So each meadow, each pasture, each cow pasture is a battlefield. And remember, the Germans are in there first. They've been in there for weeks. And they've got this place all ticked out, you know, and with, you know, infillating fire. The fields are mined as well. They would send the cows out to check where the mines, where any mines they had marked were. And if the cow blew up, that was the end of that. There was a mine there. And so it's going to be tough country. And you have these, we've traveled on them. You also have these sunken roads. And sometimes the trees form canopies over these roads. And it's drizzling. It's raining almost the entire time. And that's catastrophic for the Allies because they depend on air cover. And they had no air cover here. So both armies are fighting without a lot of air cover here. And I think we should have been prepared for the hedgerows because Field Commander Brooke on the British side had been in the Bocage. He was there during the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, and he foresaw the difficulties for an attacker in this area it's like a Civil War battle where the defense wins 9 out of 10 battles. And we knew that rooting out the Wehrmacht in this claustrophobic environment was going to be slow and deadly business. And you're fighting troops in here, now they're reinforced. You're fighting troops in here that are the equal of those, and in fact they are often the same troops that served on the Eastern Front and against the Red Army. And they're brilliant defensive fighters. They're excellent at camouflage, they're excellent at concealment. They just didn't dig into foxholes. They dug into the earth like moles, and they built tunnels under the hedgerows. This was perfect ground to defend for them. Our American troops, most of them are fresh boys. I mean, the only professional division, the only trained division, the only combat-hardened division to land at D-Day was the Big Red one. And that was purposeful. Eisenhower had considerations about sending more veteran troops in. He thought the young kids might go in. They might be more gung-ho, less afraid of dying. And the fresh troops especially were spooked by the difficulty of just seeing the enemy as they crossed these exposed fields with the Germans somewhere in the hedgerow and the fields filled with these bouncing Bettys, these infamous castrator mines that sprang up when released to explode at shoulder top or crotch level and spreading shrapnel all over your body. And the Germans also had strung taut wire across the roads of the Bocage to decapitate the occupants of American beaches. And so this becomes, like the beachhead actually, it becomes a rifleman's war. I should say more accurately, it's a mortarman's war because most of the casualties that the Allies suffered are from mortar fire. Same with the Germans. Now, and they're also snipers. They're everywhere, hanging from trees, everywhere in the tangled terrain. And the tangled terrain is murder on tanks. A tank, as General Ron explained on the beach yesterday, rolling over one of these hedgerows goes up like that and exposes its bottom, which is very vulnerable, to what's called a Panzerfaust, which is a German equivalent of a bazooka. And that's the death of that tank. And these roads are also where the tanks operate on. The roads themselves are heavily mined. Troops like to walk behind tanks. They felt safe, but not in the Bocage, because the Germans had 88 guns on hills just above the Bocage, and they blew the tanks. When they blew the tanks up, they blew the men up behind them, so men stopped walking behind tanks. Now, one American infantryman, a sergeant by the name of Curtis Cullen, a cab driver from Chicago, he helped, to solve one of the problems that the tanks confronted. He took a German roadblock. Some say it was a hedgehog, but it's probably a roadblock, and he cut it into these sharp teeth, and like that, and welded them on the front of his tank, okay? And with those teeth, you could dig into the hedgerow and lift it up. And rather than going over it, you went through it. And there's an example of, and he does it for his tank, and soon 40 to 60% of the tanks in the Sherman tanks operating in the hedgerows have these devices because they kind of look like rhinoceroses. They were called rhino tanks. And so GIs also invented a bunch of other, I can't go into them now, of what I'd call hedgerow busting techniques. And it goes to a point, armies are reflections of the societies that mobilize them. Here in this case, these innovations, I think, are examples of the mechanical capacity of ordinary Americans. These kids are guys who used to have their Chevys up on blocks and working on the carburetors and stuff. They knew mechanical difficulties. They didn't do what the Germans did. When a Jeep broke down, the German just walked away from it. The GI tried to fix it up. And I think in the originally organized Wehrmacht, ideas like colors would often percolate up from the army itself, from the common soldiers, rather than down the line, as in the German system. But even with these rhino tanks, we can't break the stalemate in this hedgerow country. And this bad weather's bothering us, and now we're in this draining war for these small, and to the GIs, seemingly insignificant pieces of real estate. And this is really tough on young replacements, and we start to pour in young replacements who are exceedingly young, 18 and 19 years old. And these guys usually arrive one at a time in units that have been together for a long time, if you take the big red one all the way back to Africa. And they're usually given the most dangerous assignments because the platoon doesn't want to waste its most experienced men. And the replacements were the guys who were most likely to escape combat by shooting themselves, usually in the left hand or in the left foot. These guys were put into hospitals, into special wards, and when they were discharged, they faced 6 months in the stockade. If you were German and you did it, your unit commander shot you on the spot. Battle shock, combat fatigue, shell shock, whatever you want to call it, was alarmingly high in the Bocage. And half of its victims were replacements who had broken down after less than 48 hours of combat. And what they did with them is they gave them sedation, a thing called sodium amytal. It's a truth serum type of thing, and knocks you out for about 48 hours. You get a night's sleep, whether you're ready or not, you give it a shower, put a uniform on, you might be dragging. The medics used to call these guys ragmen, and back in the fight you go. Some medics refused to send the guys back in, and they were court-martialed. And you see, the reason you have so many guys breaking down is, we learned this from World War I, static warfare, like trench warfare, this is like trench warfare, combat fatigue occurs much more frequently when you're fighting static warfare than when you're on the move, okay? And in this battle of the Bocage, we evacuate 30,000 cases, 30,000 guys with combat fatigue. And under artillery fire, some guys would just crawl up into a ball. Some guys would run around in circles and cry. Some guys would wander out into in a trance, kind of, almost like a zombie, into a field and start picking flowers. So by early July, the Allied armies are in crisis. They've taken 120,000 casualties by this point from the beach in. And the Germans are threatening to build this iron cordon around our army. And Bradley said later that we faced a real danger of a World War I type of stalemate, okay? And the frustration over the stalemate, the agony and frustration, causes both Bradley and Monty to resort to something they hadn't resorted to before, tremendous carpet bombing. And the second week in July, Montgomery's frustrated Canadian and British forces boxed up at Caen are going to try a breakout, and it's going to be preceded by one of the most thunderous air attacks in world history. It's Operation Charwood on July 8 and 9. And the RAF came in, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command came in, the American 8th Air Force came in, they blasted this enormous gap through Caen. And that allows Monty to take most of the city. But the German defenders, these guys from Panzer Group West, they just crawled in the holes created by the bombs into the craters, and they held their positions in the south of the town. So we got stalemate again. In fact, the bombing made things worse, in addition to killing a lot of local citizens, thousands of them. It's like at Stalingrad. When the Germans bombed Stalingrad, they created tremendously effective defensive positions behind stones and rocks and in holes for the Red Army, and they became a menacing defensive force at Stalingrad, and the same thing happened at Caen. And also, Monty's armored units couldn't move through these ruins very effectively, so he's really stalled. And with him stalled, and words percolating up that perhaps Eisenhower's going to remove him, Churchill thought about removing him. With him stalled, it's up to Bradley. And now Monty is doing something, I should say, very effective. He's holding down these panzer units, which could have been facing the Americans. So he's stalled, so Bradley comes up with a plan of his own, another carpet bombing plan called Cobra, okay? And he said, I want this thing to be the biggest thing in the world. Those were his words. And what it would do, this is cataclysmic bombing, and by the 8th Air Force. In 1 hour, he's going to put over 1,000 four-engine bombers in a very small area and drop 50,000 iron bombs into a very tight rectangle, you know, in front of the American troops. It's going to be pretty dangerous. And this is going to occur at a we took this city of Saint-Lô, I should say this. You can imagine the brutal fighting at Saint-Lô. And I'm going to go back here. Okay, there is Saint-Lô. And there's where we are and where we're going to launch Operation Cobra. The Germans are right here, okay? And below this, there's open country that leads out to Brittany, okay? And across to flat plains here and all the way around to Paris. So here we're on the brink of breaking out of the Bocage, but we can't do it, okay? Because of panzer units located just below Saint-Lô. And Saint-Lô was a murderous fight, as you'll see on your trips today. And the idea here is the commander down here is a guy named Lawton Lightning Joe Collins. He's a guy that takes Cherbourg, and he's a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign. He's a tough guy. He figures that saturation bombing is going to kill a lot of Germans, but also paralyze, traumatize a lot of others, and then he can bust through the thin crust of German defenses and plow in there. Now, the 8th Air Force doesn't want to do this bombing. Karl Spaatz, who's the head of the 8th Air Force in England and in all of Europe, as a matter of fact, says, my crews aren't trained for this stuff. They're trained to bomb oil refineries and ball bearing factories. And he wants to continue to hit oil facilities because the Germans, these attacks on oil facilities are becoming increasingly effective. But Eisenhower reins him in. He's still, after D-Day, in control of the Air Force, both Air Forces. But a lot of the airmen, the guys in the planes, they wanted to fly. They wanted to help what Ernie Pyle called the mud, sleet, and rain boys, the GIs on the ground. Rosie Rosenthal wrote this. He's with the 100th Bomb Group, American Air Force. He said, a lot of us felt that, but for the grace of God, we could be down there slugging it out in the hedgerows. So just before Bradley launches this carpet bombing operation, he flies to England to get some assurances that it's going to be safe for his troops. And he meets with the senior air commanders. Now, what he wants to do is he wants the bombers to fly in east to west, come down from England, fly in across there's a road below Saint-Lô here, okay? And he wants to fly in into an area that's about 1.5 miles wide, a corridor, and put about 1,200 bombers, heavy bombers, through that corridor and bomb east to west. That way, but the Air Force said, we want to come in this way And Bradley said, no, no, you're flying over our troops. And if you drop short, I mean, you missed the beach fortifications on D-Day, you drop short, you'll kill our troops. And the Air Force fires back and says, well, if we go through this corridor, we can't get 12 to 1,400 bombers through there in 1 hour. The airspace is too crowded. And they win that battle. So they're going to bomb north to south. Now, Monty is out of the picture on this one, but Bradley at the meeting left the meeting thinking that he got his way, that they were going to come in like this. But when he left the meeting, the air chiefs had a second conference, and they said, no way, we can't go up that road. We can't go up that parallel road. It's going to be too crowded. But a second thing came up at the meeting, the safety zone. How far were the troops going to be positioned from the bomb line, where they're going to drop the bombs, okay? And now the 8th Air Force knew it couldn't bomb accurately. It had never bombed accurately. So its leaders wanted Bradley to move the troops back 3,000 yards from the bomb line. And Bradley said, no, I want them 800 yards from the bomb line. And the Air Force came back and said, that's crazy. We're going to murder GIs. So they reach a compromise, 1,250 yards. And, but Bradley's warned that you're putting guys in danger on very dangerous ground where they could be killed by friendly fire. So on the 24th of July, the 8th flies in. It's a cloudy day, and they try to recall the mission, but some of the planes duck under the clouds and drop 700 tons of bombs on that line. And they kill a bunch of American troops. And the spillage did. 27 GIs die, about 131 are wounded, and Bradley's out of his mind about this. But the next morning, the Air Force said, we're going in the same way. Cloud cover cleared. Rosie Rosenthal leads 1,500 four-engine bombers back to St. Lo. They approached the target north to south. And the problem was they had fighter planes in front of them that started to blast the German lines, and they threw up billowing clouds of smoke and fire. And so the guys in the front of the bomber in their plexiglass cubicles are trying to fix the gauges on their Norden bombs. They can't see anything. They just see swirling clouds of smoke. And there is also red smoke. This line is a long line, and they start to put up red smoke. And they say, that's the red smoke you want to hit for. The troops are well behind the red smoke. But on that day, the winds are blowing that way back toward you guys, the troops. So the red smoke's blowing back there. The guys see the red smoke, and they drop on the red smoke, and it's a catastrophe. Ernie Pyle was there and wrote this. He said, and he was excited at first when they came over. He said, the flight across the sky, he's talking about these big boys, he said was, he'd be right under there. He said, the flight across the sky was slow, studied, and he said, I've never known a storm, I've never known a machine of any resolve of man that had about it such an aura of ghastly relentlessness. He said, God, how we admired those men up there. And so these thundering machines fill the sky with what Pyle called a doom-like sound. And it creates this tremendous spectacle of war, and the troops are frozen. They're just watching it. Like all of us look up and watch a plane, and they're frozen in their positions. The bombs start exploding all around them, and as the smoke line goes back, and the GIs who weren't hit could feel concussions. I've talked to some of them later, in their chest and even in their eyes. They thought their eyeballs were rattling. And 111 soldiers, American soldiers, are killed, and at least 500 others are heavily wounded, including General Leslie McNair, who's there, as an observer. Eisenhower also observed this from Bradley's headquarters. He said, I'll never use heavy bombers in support of troops again. He changed his mind later on. But Bradley lashes out at these overpaid, as he called them, over-decorated, overrated bomber boys. But part of the fault was his. I mean, he's the guy who wanted this quick slashing assault, and he wanted his troops up close. But having them close did work, despite the wastage of life. The Germans, of course, got the worst of this. Franz Bayerlin, the commander of Panzer Lehr Division, who's on the front line here, they took the worst of it. he said the bombers came on like a conveyor belt, and they burned tanks, and they burned men, and they destroyed communications, and they transformed Panzer-Lehr's front line into a, Berlin called it a moonscape. And Lightning Joe Collins the next day leaps at the opportunity. There's an excellent road network that led toward Avranches, just to the south, and he punches through. And ahead of him are fighter bombers, ahead of the tank columns, and they're on kill and destroy missions. And reporters called this at the time the St. Lo breakout, and it clearly is the decisive moment in Eisenhower's campaign for Europe. And this becomes George Patton's show. I mean, he's the apostle of armored warfare. He's called in from England, where he'd been a D-Day decoy, and he takes charge of this newly activated Third Army. And he begins immediately an all-out drive south, okay? And he's going to, here we are at St. Lo, where the breakout occurs, and they're going to move down toward Avranches and out toward Brittany to maybe take those fortified towns that have the subpens, okay? Not knowing that the subs have been moved to Norway, okay? There's still a couple down there, and the towns are very heavily defended, and then Patton wheels around and then comes in this way. We'll meet him again at Argentan a little bit later in this lecture. Okay, so the breakout occurs, and it's a road race. And Patton's moving incredibly at 50 miles a day. Okay, that's real fast. And toward these bluffs at Avranches, toward the Brittany Peninsula, and then he turns and, as I said, and goes after the 7th Army in France. And it's one of the most astonishing achievements in the history of mobile warfare. I mean, the Germans invented it, blitzkrieg warfare. Boom! We gave it to them right at the gazoo here, I'll tell you. Close coordination, tanks, troops, artillery, fighter bombers acting as aerial artillery. This is blitzkrieg warfare, and the Americans were far better at it than the Germans. Tank crews didn't stop to cook. They didn't stop to relieve themselves. One tanker said, we crap at our helmets and we cook in them. Patton, of course, is exultant. You know, I mean, this is everything he's dreamed about. You know, he said, compared to war, all forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance. God, oh, I love it. And, but one of the heroes here is kind of an unrecognized character, General Elwood, Pete Quesada. Now, he's head of a unit operating out of England and now stationed in northern France called the 9th Air Force. That's unlike the 8th. That's tactical air. Those are the kind of guys that bomb Utah Beach, 2-engine bombers. And they're used to covering for troops. And what Quesada did is he's a very innovative air leader. And his fighter bombers had done really heavy damage to the German rail lines and transportation systems in France and Belgium before the invasion. And they're equally effective after the beachhead. Quesada took his pilots, the GIs all thought, oh, those pampered air boys. He took his pilots to the front lines, put them in foxholes. He took them to hospitals where GIs were all banged up. And he said, now you see how much better off you are than these poor suckers, these poor devils who are fighting the Germans in the hedgerow. And then he puts radio sets in the tanks so the tank guys can talk to the pilots. Then he puts pilots in the tanks so they can understand air language. And now there's complete coordination. This is why it was so effective between the tanks and the planes. Plane can spot a German Panzer. The tank can move in and kill it, or the tank can spot it. The plane can spot the tank and do it, or vice versa. And by the summer of '44, you got this close air support. So you got blitzkrieg warfare, a German innovation, becomes one of the, ironically, one of the salient features of Germany's defeat. And don't forget, what makes this possible is the Luftwaffe is entirely absent from the skies. These fighter bombers, you know, they inflict lethal damage on German divisions that are being pushed back. And at this point, Monty, while we're moving like this, has begun to move down from Caen. He makes a breakthrough. And he's heading, mostly Canadians, under his command, are heading toward Falaise, okay? While the Americans are busting out here and then looping back around here toward Argentan. That's where Patton is headed for. Now, I don't have time this morning, because I do want to take some questions, to delve into Mortain, which is Hitler's desperate, suicidal, really hastily planned all-out counterattack, which occurs if you go on the Mortain expedition today. You'll see the ground there. I don't have time to get into that, nor do I have time to get into the Falaise gap over here between Argentan and Falaise, which was never closed. Monty moved too closely. Patton moved swiftly. Bradley held him back, saying that he didn't want the two armies collided. Monty wanted to close this gap itself. This is a gap through which the German army is going to retreat to the Rhine, and we don't close it fast enough. We don't close it until mid-August. And it's, I think, both commanders' faults. But the guides told me they're fully, prepared to explain both of these operations, as they've done. The guides have been fantastic, on your trip. I do want to say this about Falaise, though. When these Allied forces coalesce, British, Polish, Canadians, Americans, they have air-powered tanks and artillery, and they massacre the retreating Germans. The Allied Air Force flies 3,000 sorties. Imagine that, 3,000 sorties, individual flights a day against the German army. And as one German soldier said, it was complete chaos. He said, that's when I thought, this is the end of the Reich. This is the end of my world. Men were screaming for their mothers. They're screaming, they always do, they don't scream for dad. As these shells come in and bombs rain down on them, these fast-moving Shermans track them down like you track down a wolf. And the high ground around Falaise, as you'll see, around the valley, is called the Balcony of Death. And up on these hills are 3,000 Allied guns. It's a lot of firepower. One of the gunners said there's too much to shoot at. And Ike wrote in his memoirs that the famous quote, the battlefield at Falaise was one of the great killing grounds of the war. It was literally possible, he said, to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead or decaying flesh. The Germans left behind most of their equipment. 50,000 of them were captured. 100,000 were killed. And we'll never know how many got away, but the number's roughly around 50,000 get through the Falaise pocket, and the Allies will meet them again on the Rhine. So this Battle of Falaise is a culminating battle. It's the end of an 80-day-long battle for Normandy that begins on D-Day. And it's the most decisive battle on the Western Front. And next to the Bulge, the second biggest fight that the Army will engage in Europe. And the butcher bill is very high. The Germans lost nearly 500,000 men, 440 combatants, 440,000 combatants, killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans lost 250,000. The Allies lost 250,000, but 2/3 of them are Americans. The Flyboys really took it, 16,700 killed or missing. That's big loss. And so did the French. Nearly 20,000 French villagers and townspeople were killed in the liberation of Normandy. So they paid a terrific price. This is on top of 15,000 Frenchmen who were killed in the pre-invasion bombing. And 76,000 people in the area we're in right now lost their homes and nearly everything they had. And Caen is turned into a cemetery of stone and ash. But the battle is important. It's the prelude to the liberation of Paris, but more importantly, this triumphant American drive to the Rhine. And it's a campaign that's going to be joined by a campaign that was supposed to be launched on D-Day morning simultaneously with these landings in Normandy. And that's the landing at Marseille. The one that Churchill had opposed this, but Eisenhower insisted, Marshall insisted, and it went forward. And one of the generals in that invasion, Jacob Devers, he took his 6th Army in a long march up the Rhone Valley to the German border. And what that did, this was calamitous for both sides. It forced the Germans to begin to withdraw their forces from southern Germany, but not before the Gestapo and the security police massacred all their prisoners. With the Germans gone, finally, the resistance fighters launched a retaliatory campaign against the collaborators and against captured Nazis. Now, They killed very few military prisoners, but they did kill 20,000 Nazi officials and collaborators. So it was a bloodbath. Further north, while this is going on, our armies sweep across all those World War I battlefields, the Somme, the Marne, right to the Belgian border. All those places made famous, by the First World War. So just 100 days after Normandy, we've got our armies massed on a 250-mile front, the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, as the Americans call it. This was a recently strengthened defense line that Hitler had built in front of the Rhine, so his troops could fight with the Rhine behind them, and they could fight suicidally. He thought if they fought on the other side, they'd retreat. This way, they can't retreat. So with the two armies facing each other, the battle for France is over, and the battle for Germany is about to begin. Thank you. Appreciate it. We do have time for questions if there are any. Bill.
John, if you look at the bigger picture, Eisenhower had this concept of a broad front going across all of essentially northern Europe, and it's apparent from this action here that devolved pretty quickly into going south, and we never did get that far north incursion that was ultimately taken over by the Russians, coming the other way.
Well, yeah, Monty went in that way. He went in across the north. We tried it with a parachute assault, but Monty does break through to the north, and there is a kind of a broad front coming in from this side, and so you do get that pincer move.
But when did we give up the notion of getting to Berlin?
Well, I don't think Eisenhower ever wanted to get to Berlin, and Patton did. There was disgruntlement. Churchill was upset about it, but Eisenhower was pretty firm on the point that the Russians had a far more likely chance of reaching Berlin, far more likely chance of reaching Berlin more quickly. And then what do you got there? Two armies fighting for what? A city that the Russians control. And also, I mean, the Russians lose 250,000 men taking Berlin. And so that's another slaughter fest that maybe wasn't necessary. So it was one of those things of, who's got the boots on the ground, who's in there. Because, here's the point about this whole, we could talk a little bit more about this tonight. June 44, terrifically important month, the most important month of the war. Not only do you have the landings here, but, Rick was talking about the projection of American power globally. Well, how about this? I mean, as he does in his Liberation trilogy, you've got just 2 days before this, the liberation of Rome. We finally break out, from Anzio and take the hills and move on Rome, and Clark liberates Rome. At the same time in the Pacific, just a week and a half after D-Day, we are launching the biggest assault yet of the Pacific War against Saipan. And that's as important, Saipan. That's D-Days in the Pacific. That's as important to victory against Japan as D-Day is to victory against Germany, because we can now place B-29s on Saipan and bomb the Japanese homeland. So it's the end. And here also in Normandy, what Hitler had said is, because a lot of people ask me, why did he move troops from the, why did he throw so much into this battle? Wasn't the primary enemy the Slavs, okay, the Russians, Germany's eternal enemy, okay? And he figures geography is going to save him for a time. The Russians are a little too far away. And that the Allies, if they break through, are closer to the German border. But later in June, the Russians launch Operation Bagration. Millions, not hundreds of thousands, millions, 6 million troops in 3 gigantic drives into German-occupied Europe are moving toward Berlin and the end. So you got Bagration, Saipan, Paris, D-Day. And when Nick and I were writing the script for Beyond All Boundaries, which we show at the museum, we really wanted to make this point that people should see the war simultaneously, not see it as it's often done in textbooks with the European theater here and the Pacific theater here as if they're 2 wars. They were very closely linked. So the whole wheel of war turns in June, And we try to do that in the film. And it turns in a matter of 3 weeks. And at this point, the Germans can't win. And now it's not inevitable, but what they're fighting for, by the way, here in Normandy, von Rundstedt understood this and tried to explain it to the Fuhrer and was fired. Made a famous statement when they wouldn't pull the tanks further away from the beaches because they were getting hammered by American naval gunfire, and Hitler told him he wouldn't pull them back, and he said then shut down the war. Well, they shut him down. 3 days later, he was replaced, only to be brought back again later on. I think it was in September. But von Rundstedt understood that what the German High Command, like Rommel and Rundstedt, hoped is that they could do the same thing the Japanese were doing to us in the Pacific. Knowing they couldn't win the war, they can bleed us. They still nurse the illusion that democracies can't fight long wars. And maybe Japan thought the primary enemy will be Germany, and we can bleed the Americans and bring them to the peace table and let us have oil-rich Indonesia, for example. Could be a chip on the bargaining table. What the Germans are counting on is our fanatical hatred of communism. They know about it. And they're figuring they can bleed the Americans here in Western Europe fighting these battles of attrition like this and maybe bring us to the peace table and say, okay, we're out of France. Let us fight the Russians. We'll stop them. You won't have an Iron Curtain, you use the word later on. And some crazy German generals, not understanding that we had an unconditional surrender as a pledge, tried to make inquiries and sent messages to American commanders. They're constantly coming through the line saying, we'll throw down our arms or give us arms to fight the Russians on the other side. So that's all they can do here, the Germans can do. They can really bleed us badly and prolong the war. And you say, okay, well, what does it mean prolonging the war? Well, look at the figures that Rick gave us. The last months, 10,000 guys lost in the last months of the war. William Tecumseh Sherman said, well, once the whirlpool of warfare begins, it just sucks and sucks and sucks and sucks. And wars get worse at the end. I mean, this is a war in the Pacific that had to be ended with an atomic bomb. Maybe mercifully for both sides. So it's crazy. And if Hitler hadn't put a bullet in his brain, in his bunker, maybe we'd be fighting longer. So a longer war means more death. Hitler could complete the Holocaust. He gets his jets up in the air. He has submarines that can breathe with snorkels on it. He can still cause a lot of problems for us. He can't win, but he can still cause problems. So prolonging the war is very important to the Nazis, and shortening it is very important to us. And we're running out of men. And we're putting musicians on the line, we're putting cooks on the line. And the Army, which had a racist policy early in the war of not integrating blacks and whites in common fighting units on the front and having blacks only serve under white commanders, in desperation, in the last months of the war, begins to put black replacements side by side, shoulder to shoulder with white troops, and there was no problem, absolutely no problem. So it's a long answer. Wow. Okay. Anybody else? Any questions? Get there.
Don, what's the relative strategic importance when all this was going on of the campaign in Alsace for Strasbourg? I know the French army was
very
up
important.
There, and the repulse of Nordwind, the German last attack, I guess, in February of '45.
Well, I mean, this whole line, I mean, we were talking about the Red Bull Express the other day. Let me put it in these terms. There's stages to warfare. And in September, we got victory fever. We thought we were going to punch right through to Germany. But we ran out of fuel because we couldn't get fuel fast enough from these Omaha beaches and from Cherbourg fast enough to the front lines because we hadn't captured Antwerp yet. And we don't capture Antwerp, I think, until September 29th, or maybe it was the 27th, but it was the last week of September. And the Germans had ruined the port, and that's the major port where you could bring in oil, a major port, that in Hamburg in Western Europe. So the armies all along that line are running out of gas. I mean, Patton's at Metz, he can't bounce through. they can't bounce through around the Strasbourg area, so the whole thing is held up. But when they finally do punch through, and they get the fuel, and Antwerp is opened, and they begin to all, a straight front line straight into, and that's when the decision was made that Bill referred to. The final decision was made. It's not going to be Berlin. Yeah. Anyone else?
Morning, Don. James Clement, up top right.
Oh, okay. Hi, James.
You said that the Americans do blitzkrieg better than the Germans. Do you think that's at this point of the war, or do you even think late 30s, early 40s blitzkrieg Americans were better than the Germans were then?
Well, I think we got a chance to use it here. We couldn't use, the terrain doesn't allow you to use it in Italy. I mean, the terrain and the weather. I mean, that's mountain fighting in Italy. And it's rough, almost hand-to-hand fighting. And the Germans are building one fortification line after the other. So it's not good ground for mobile warfare. We don't have enough trained, effective tank units to square up one-on-one with the Africa Corps in North Africa. The British are actually better prepared initially than we are there. Sicily's also really tough terrain, and tough for tank warfare. The Big Red One fought some murderous battles up there. Tanks are effective almost as static artillery. But once you get onto flat country, and this is the first time you have wide open spaces, you can really begin to move your armies. And the Germans, of course, are crippled by the fact that they're running out of fuel because Spatz's oil attacks are working. By September of 1944, Germany's down to 19% of its production, oil production, 19%. And we are an energy colossus. We have 90% of the world's oil. Okay. And and Hitler, in the end, actually runs out of gas. And the Japanese do too. That's not a simplistic explanation for how the war ended, but it's certainly very, very important. And you need it for mobile warfare. You need to put planes in the air. You need to run gigantic aircraft carriers, merchant ships, etc. Fuel, it's a blood of war. We had it. He asked me why the B-29. The B-29 is developed it's a four-engine bomber, but it's much larger than a B-17. It has a pressurized cabin. It has automatic gun control systems. And the big thing is its range. So it's ideal for the Pacific War. If the war had continued, there's no question, I've seen Air Force documents, we would have brought massive numbers of B-29s into England. Now, we would have had to lengthen the airfields for takeoff and landing, but they would have been brought in. And the other thing we would have done, absolutely for sure, because the Air Force had decided to do it, they would have firebombed Germany the way they firebombed Japan. There would have been 60 Dresdens. Now, the British did Dresden, and the Americans just threw some bombs onto some railroad facilities. But we would have went to firebombing. I mentioned, I think a couple days ago, that we had a German architect, Mendelssohn, create a German village, and then a Japanese architect created a Tokyo neighborhood, and we firebombed them incessantly in the Nevada proving grounds. So we were going to go to firebombing. That's what I mean about this war was going to accelerate. We wanted it to be over. It must have been very frustrating for the Allied commanders when the dust had cleared after the Battle of Bulge and they'd driven the Germans back, and they got those reports that they had more jets, they had those submarines, and we didn't have the intelligence yet. We had it, we had the raw intelligence, but it hadn't been interpreted until February as to how badly we had hurt Germany at this point. And we now know after the war that Speer, who was gutless, ballless, unbelievable, he wouldn't confront the Fuhrer and tell him that the war was over. He finally gave him a note and told him that it's kaput. We can't finish it, and we can't prevail. But that's when we learned that we delivered a death blow. But then the frustration is you're fighting an enemy that won't surrender. I don't understand. I don't want to shift this to the Pacific, but I don't understand why a maniac like the emperor, who I thought should have been hanged after the war, why he is sitting in Tokyo while this firebombing is going on, knowing he can't win the war, and he doesn't go to the peace, call his generals in and urge them to go to the peace table. And he's seeing this. He, like Hitler, he had no guts. He didn't go out to the bomb sites. He made one tour of Tokyo in an armored car, and there's a film of it, and never got out of the car. Now, old Winnie, fat little Winnie's in there with his cane, picking around the ruins, talking to people, getting photographed in bomb cities. And Hitler never went to a bomb city, never. He like had the blinders on there. So you're fighting fanatics like that. You're fighting fanatics like that, people who won't surrender. And that was the frustration at the end of the war. And that's what leads to violent acceleration of warfare, when you defeat someone and can't finish them off. And they're fighting with suicidal fury. Yeah. Okay, let's go. Trip time.